Hey, my name is Janelle Cochran, your friendly neighborhood hacker. Welcome to the MinTech Agency Tech Chat. You're probably here because you're looking to upgrade your career or looking to start a new career in technology. And I'm here to answer some questions and to give you a kind of a starting point on like how do you get into this industry, what are the places you can learn, and hopefully jumpstart your idea and turn it into reality using software. So let's start today talking about how do you choose the right open source project. Okay, I'm going to talk about what open source is, where do you find it, what are the uses of open source, where it is in the world, and hopefully definitely if you have any questions, jump into the chat and I'll answer them hopefully at the best of my ability. Okay, so first, if you're looking to enhance your career in software development or just to start, one of the places that I recommend is looking at open source software. Open source software is software where you can see the source code, you're free to use it, you're free to modify it, and you're free to distribute it to anywhere that may and use it in any way you possibly can. And so open source software basically runs most of the world now, the digital world. So that goes from the servers, that goes from our phones, that goes for the apps, the software or libraries that our apps use on our phones. That also includes some of the components of consoles, gaming consoles, our TVs, hey, and any of the Internet of Things like our Alexa devices, our Google Home devices. All of these devices use components of open source software where members across the world, community members across the world, people just like you entering tech or have been there for many years, work together to solve a problem. And hopefully that problem works for other people. Okay, so some of the largest open source projects out there are, a good example would be Firefox web browser. Firefox web browser is an open source project. Also Chrome. Chrome is an open source project. If you ever heard of GitHub, GitHub, github.com, github.com started as an open source project. So the place in which people put their open source projects on one of the one of the top places in the world, that started out as an open source project. That also goes for the Android parts of the Android operating system, which you use on your phones and many Android phones is also a pretty big open source project. And so there are companies that you may choose to work for at some point or start on your own that will make open source a key product. They will create software that is open to the public and then have members of their employees work on it with community members to make sure everybody receives the value from it. Some good examples of companies that invest heavily in open source is one, Google, of course. Also AT&T, Adobe, Canonical, the creators of the Ubuntu operating system, Microsoft, GitHub again, GitLab, GITLAB, Mozilla, which are the creators of Firefox, and a host of other companies. So definitely as you're embarking on your tech career, definitely ask your interviewers or ask the people that are in the companies that you are working with that, hey, are there any projects that the company contributes to or owns and manages? And so usually those companies are working with community members across the world to make sure that software is tested, make sure you get the features that you want, and make sure it remains free and available to everybody. So next, where do you find open source software? Well, there's many places actually. There's a few websites over the past decade or so that have sprung up that hold collections of open source projects. One of the most popular is GitHub, GITHUB, so GitHub.com. If you go to GitHub.com, you can see the source code for many of the open source projects that or some of the software that you use, covering a wide range of topics, anywhere from gaming or writing books or creating instructional material and just about anything. 3D printing, the software that runs the 3D printers, running software on your Raspberry Pi, creating video games with video consoles, and everything you can possibly think of. It covers all topics. The second popular repository or website you can go to find open source software is GitLab, GITLAB.com. So if you go there, you'll find that you can find other open source projects that you can look into. The third is created by a company based in Australia called Atlassian. The name of that website is bitbucket.com. So BIT bucket. All right. And so if you go to those places, you will be able to explore to see what are projects that are present on there. And the use of going through open source software, it provides you a means to kind of peek under the hood. We know that as consumers of technology, we know that if it looks good, if it's easy to use, then we're more likely to use it again if we get that value. Looking at the source code or looking at the open source software source code gives you an idea of like, how do you create those experiences? How do you create augmented reality experiences? How do you create these filters that people use online? How do you store and do analysis on data with these tools to help us all become more informed? And so looking at that open source software gives you an idea of how does the online community work together to solve software problems. Okay, so the three ways in which I would recommend, or the reasons why I would recommend looking at open source software, irrespective to you, starting your career now or looking to level up a little bit, would be first is just to watch. Look at how these communities behave online, how they work together. And these communities are worldwide, international communities. And so working on one piece of software, you have people from almost every country that has internet access across the world, and then people from different languages, different backgrounds. And all that really matters is people just working together in a welcoming way, in a non-toxic way to develop software that hopefully is useful, not to just the people who are writing the software, but for everyone in the world, even if you don't know what the software, how to write software, ever care to learn how to do that. And so one way that I suggest is just going to those repositories, going to github.com, going to gitlab.com, looking at how people communicate and build their discussions around certain software topics. So even if you're not looking to be a software developer, there are other roles in open source software projects that you can take on. There's people who write documentation. There's people who test it, make sure that it works well in a browser if it's a browser-based application, or on a phone, it's a phone-based application. There's those who manage the issues or the tickets that come in, the requests that people have. There's also those who simply say, hey, I want to test it out to see if I can run in my environment. So it might be an entire company willing to try to help their community stay online and stay alive. And then some are just answering kind of beginners questions. So people who want to start out, who are trying to understand how do you contribute to software. Those people need some sort of point of contact, and the people in the open source community are very welcoming and want everyone to feel encouraged to contribute in meaningful ways. Okay? So just watching the communities. How do people act online? How do people solve these problems online by typing in boxes? The second way you can engage with open source software is using it. And so using it may mean using it as a consumer. You may buy a product that has open source software embedded in it. Or if you are a software developer, you may choose to use open source libraries to enhance your code, to help you solve a problem faster, because someone else have solved a simpler or a similar problem before in their open source project. So being able to combine your code with open source code helps you get to the goals faster. You get to learn how to solve those problems that may have been blockers for you, and you see new solutions to problems you've already solved. And so definitely using open source software is definitely very useful. And so when you come to using open source software, there are a couple of things that I recommend you look at when you're choosing, hey, do I use this library in my open source software? One is the license. So if you're on GitHub or GitLab, you'll notice a file that's using all caps called license. And so those licenses for open source tell you the conditions in which you can use, modify, or distribute the software. Luckily, companies like GitHub has created like summary pages or summary websites describing what is the kind of general idea or energy behind a specific source code open source license. That website is called chooselicense.com. Chooselicense.com. And so with chooselicense.com, you will be able to see when there's an open source license embedded in some software that you want to contribute to or you want to use, then you have the opportunity to see like, well, what are the parameters around it? Can you turn that use of software into some profitable business? Can you, what does it mean when you're contributing and using and distributing? What are the requirements around that? Are you required to, give your users copies of the open source code you're using? Yes or no? And so open source software open source licensing provides you the context or the parameters in which you can distribute and use and modify that open source that you have your eyes on. Okay. And the next way in which you can engage with open source is contributing. And the first step of contributing is looking at the repo. So looking at the repo, seeing when was the last change? Was the last change last week or last year? How active is that community? Are people talking and chatting in the issue, solving problems, or is there no activity there? And so usually when you contribute to open source projects, a well organized project will have some sort of what is called a contributor agreement. And so a contributor agreement says that, hey, you are aware that when you are writing code and embedding it in this piece of software, that there may be others or other companies that may use that software you provided to enhance their products or to use open source software and that same open source software in a slightly different manner. So definitely contributing to open source software is just another way to engage. So let's go over that again. The 3 ways to engage with open source software. 1, watching. Just going in, watching, looking at the communities. 2, using it in your open source projects or in your company projects. And 2, contributing to the solutions, contributing to those open source projects. And so when I tend to look at a project that I want to possibly contribute to or that I want to use, I look at the issues. I look at to see what bugs are present. That tells me how active the community is and how well the community is solving those problems. It also gives me an opportunity to see if I could stretch myself a little bit more to learn a new skill to help that community solve a problem. And that's kind of the spirit of open source, is that, no one has to come in as an expert. We're all amateurs in the traditional sense of we're pursuing this out of passion most of the time. And then so we want to be able to work together in a sustainable manner that allows us to solve these problems not only for ourselves, but hopefully the software that we write also help others get access to things online to be able to enhance their own skills and to be able to enhance their own careers and implement their ideas. Software is one of those opportunities where we can take these kind of very kind of intangible ideas and make them somewhat real in the digital world. So any social impact project, any idea that you've always had and wondered if it was possible, I believe that open source software can help you get there. I believe that you don't have to start from ground zero of code. I feel like there's some topic out there where there's some open source software that can help jumpstart your idea, to take your idea from idea to fruition. And if you have any questions, definitely jump up in the chat and ask away. So as I go, I'm going to give you an idea of some open source projects that I really like, some of my favorite. I'll tell you what they do. I'll tell you the languages they're written in, and some of the companies probably use it. So I'm just going to jump in there. The first piece of open source software I really like is this library called Scientist. Scientist is a library written in the Ruby programming language. This particular library actually started at GitHub, and so what they did, they needed a way to take some of the massive amounts of traffic to their websites that's using their software, and say, hey, we want to run an experiment in real time. we want to take a portion of our users and run them through this different code path that helps test a feature or to see if people even like the feature that we added to our software. So not everyone's getting this new feature, just some, just enough to validate your idea. So scientists, written in the Ruby programming language, is typically used with the framework Ruby on Rails, which is a web framework built in Ruby. And so that's definitely one of my favorites. One of my second favorites is the web framework Django, Django. So the Django programming language is written, the Django web framework is written in the Python programming language. I'm a member of the Python Software Foundation. And definitely I want to promote the use of Python, not only in terms of web development, but in terms of data analytics, in terms of machine learning, in terms of instruction creation, and also just, teaching, controlling Internet of Things devices. Python is a very, very versatile language. It has a very mature community. It kind of had its, definitely took off in the early 2000s with the scientific community. So you'll see a lot of projects that are definitely very critical to the science community. Anything from analyzing environmental data, anything from facial recognition or object recognition, a lot of that's written in Python. Django, the web framework written in Python, is so that you can just build websites, essentially. So you can build websites or these things called APIs, or application programming interfaces. And what these APIs do, or these application programming interfaces do, they're just the things that help your devices talk with things on the internet. We know that websites have visual kind of components. We can see the buttons, we can see the text boxes, we can see the images. But typically those websites, that visual or interface that you see, talks to some other server somewhere in the world. And so Django has the tools to both help you create that user interface on the web, but also help you create the components that you don't see, which is the data that's transferred between the user interface you see and all the rest of the internet. So definitely those are definitely a couple of my favorite. Another favorite of mine is very popular in the data analytics community, which is pandas, just like the animal pandas. And so pandas is definitely used for some of the data, is used heavily in the data science community. Some way for you to interact with a database, some way for you to do high-level analyses, even embed machine learning kind of capabilities in a very efficient way. So that's also a library created, written in the Python programming language. So that's great. So is Django, and there's a question here, is Django more important? I'm gonna try to interpret that one. So it sounds like you're asking if Django is more important than Ruby on Rails, which language is most important? Okay, so the two languages I mentioned is Python and Ruby. I don't think any language is more important, but I will say that some languages are used more heavily for some topics than others. So when it comes to data science, there is a lot of people use Python. It's very readable, it's very approachable. You can actually write it in multiple ways. There's multiple ways to write the same solution. So a lot of data scientists use Python. It's very approachable. Ruby, on the other hand, is definitely used by those who are writing software for computers, meaning they're writing software that runs in the background on a machine, or they build it, use websites. They use the Ruby on Rails web framework, which is written in Ruby, and so they use that to their advantage. Ruby has some built-in testing facilities, meaning that the code that you write, you don't have to blindly just imagine or just assume that it works well. It has built-in facilities that are pretty robust to help you make sure your code is correct. And so they have slightly different features. So I wouldn't say one is more important. The question is, what is the use of that language in a specific field? And I definitely think data analytics is kind of where Python is really shining right now. Okay, here's another question. Is it required as part of the licensing to tell your application users that you are using an open source library? Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say yes. You should always disclose that that you are using open source software. However, it might not be required by the license itself for you to disclose that. Depending on the license, you may be prevented from saying that you're using that open source library because they don't want to be seen as endorsing your project. So if you say a good example is the D3 um, uh, uh, graphing library. It's like a JavaScript or TypeScript based data visualization library. And so one of the key elements of their licensing is that, hey, you can't say that you use us really. You can't because we're not promoting you, even though you may use it. And so that's it kind of depends on the license whether or not you have to tell your users. Some licenses are what are called copyleft licenses. So licenses that say if you make changes, then you have to tell the community what are your changes relative to what the original source code was. So you may have to inform people of the changes you've made if they are very significant, if you decide to kind of bring it in-house and do it on your own. Another time in which you may have to disclose what the open source software is a particular license where that says that if people are using your software online, you may have to give them a copy of the open source licenses, or the open source code itself. So if you have your own project and the library uses a license called the GNU Public License Affero, AFFERO. That license said that if your software, connects to the internet and people are using it from the internet, meaning that they don't get a copy, they just use it from the internet like a website, then you're required to give them a copy of the source code that they're interacting with. And so that may be another way to disclose who gets the source code. So hope I answered your question. Okay. Let's see, another really fun open source library is actually created by Facebook originally. React is an open source library and framework. React is written it's a JavaScript based language. So that means that JavaScript runs in the browser or it may run on a server. But usually when we interact with the web, we're interacting with JavaScript on in a web browser. And so that is what's going to build some of our most modern interfaces. And when you go to Facebook or Instagram, for example, a lot of their components are built with this library React. Even though it started within the Facebook company, it's definitely grown on its own, and the entire world uses it and contributes to it on a day-to-day. Another project that runs similarly in parallel to React is Angular, and Angular was created by Google, and it has its own community as well. And again, you're interacting with web applications. It may help you build the interface, and then it's definitely solving the same problem differently. And so it definitely shows that you can most programming languages are very flexible. Okay. I see another question. In which position we get better career? Okay, so I see what you're saying. So what is better, being a developer or a tester? I would definitely say I would say that you can start at developer or tester. The reason why is because both development and testing go hand in hand. And so if you start as a tester, it may give you an idea of like what are the value that people should get when they're using your piece of software. Does the software work well? And then another way to answer that question is, does the software work well in the user interface? Does the software work well in the runtime, in the background? And so testers tend to try to use various tools to try to determine that. Developers, on the other hand, are those who write the software. And so you may start out saying, how do I solve these complex problems using software, by writing software? And then by the act of writing software, you may be forced to test your code. So you will become a tester by act of becoming a developer. And so I like software development. I think everyone can do software development. And I think there's a lot of testers who are formerly developers, meaning they may not have the desire to write code, but they may want to check for correctness. And so it's really on your preference. What's better is really determined on what you really like and what project you really like working with. Thanks for your question. Okay. Well, I think that's my time. I appreciate you putting in your questions. If you have any, if you want to reach out, definitely find definitely look for me on civilhacker.com. You go to the blog civilhacker.com/blog. You'll see how I use software and open source to try to make positive social impact. And thanks for joining me. Bye.